Hi everyone, it's Elise from Kit and Cloud Coloring Classes, and today I'm going to be showing you a quick tutorial on how I color branches or tree trunks and the foliage as well. Now, this is a really great technique that you can use on absolutely any image at all. I'm going to be showing you how to do this today on an image that I've already colored that's part of our brand new Magical Moments coloring class for pencils. So if you'd like to color the rest of this image with me, you can find the full class over at kitandclouder.com, but this is a little preview of one of the chapters. I've been showing you little previews of these classes because I think when we see a big scene all together, it can feel a little bit overwhelming, like we're not capable of doing something that intricate, especially when we're just starting out with our coloring. But when you see it all broken down into tiny little goals like we're doing here today, it's a lot more achievable and a lot less scary to do. And that's how I do it in our classes as well. We do it one step at a time, nice and easy, and focus on the very, very basics of coloring. So you understand not just how to do it, but also that why behind what we're doing and starting to learn some of those art foundations and theories that you can apply to all different images after class. So if you're already in our classes and maybe you've been a little bit nervous to start or you haven't had a lot of time to jump in, I'd recommend even just starting with this tutorial here today. It's a really great way just to get a little bit of color on the page so you can practice, you've made that little start, and it's a lot more motivating to keep going as well. Remember, you only need 10 minutes to take a little bit of time for self-care, and at the end of the day, that's what your hobbies are for. A little bit of challenge and a little bit of instruction helps keep you in the present moment, helps keep you stay mindful so you can focus on the task in front of you and just have a bit of a break from all of that stress around you. So let's go ahead and jump in here today. Now, before I lay any color down on the page, I do need to touch on one very important art basic, and that is light source. Now, it's important we talk about this in all of our coloring tutorials, and even if you have heard this before, do listen again because it does take time to sink in, learn, and understand. Light source is basically anything in our scene that produces light, like the sun up in the sky, the moon. In this image, we have our lantern, which is the secondary source of light as well. Without light, we simply don't see objects, so we wouldn't have any understanding of where to place light colors or dark colors to make something look three-dimensional. So what happens is, when we have light source, the light rays come down and they hit the parts of the image that are raised up toward those light rays. These parts are the lightest and brightest, and they're called the highlights. Now, opposite to the highlight are the parts that get hit by the light rays last. So they're curving or slanting away from the light usually. And these are called our shadows. Now, between highlight and shadow, we have what's called the midtone. And the midtone is a true color of the object because it's not affected by the light or the shade. So when we color an image like this, we usually work with what's called ambient lighting. Now, ambient lighting is like a major source of light in the scene. This image is a little bit different because we've got the lantern and the glow, so we add in an extra light source. But we won't be covering that in today's tutorial because we're just going to show you just the basics at the bottom here. But essentially, whatever is popping out toward us, think of those light rays coming down as hitting first, and that's what's going to be the lightest and brightest. And the parts that are further back from those light rays are going to be darkest. Now, another important thing that a lot of people don't know about, but it really makes the difference in creating depth in your coloring, is something called cast shadows. So, can you see I'm holding something over my hand here, and see that shadow that's on my hand? It's a shadow that's cast by an object in front or above onto the object below or behind. And what it's doing is showing those distance between the levels of my objects there. So the closer my objects are together, the darker and harder those shadows are. And the further apart they are, the softer and more dispersed they become. So this is really important because that's what's really creating the depth between the objects on the page. The number one thing people come to me and ask about is how do I create depth? And using light source and using cast shadows, that's the way you're going to get there. but it does take time and practice to learn. And that's why our monthly classes are so important, because it's important to learn on all different topics, all different techniques and objects and styles. So don't just sit with what's comfortable for you. Going outside of your comfort zone is always going to give you the most holistic learning experience. You're going to try shapes and techniques that you otherwise wouldn't try. For example, if you love florals and you only pick the floral classes to do, you're not going to really advance your coloring a lot. And you're going to get to that point where you kind of plateau out and you're a little frustrated because you're not achieving that growth that you're seeing others achieve. So always make sure that you're trying to challenge yourself and try new things, because you'll be pushing and growing every time you do. Okay, so let's jump in. We're going to start doing our coloring here today. So I'm going to move this off to the side. And you can see we've already got these wonderful lines drawn in on the branch here. So we're going to use them to help create our texture. Now, a lot of images don't have these detail lines, but you can see it's really basic, quick and easy, and you can add them in yourself. I'm going to start with a dark brown pencil, and you'll find all the colors that I'm using in the description below the video, along with some different brands as well. If you're not using the same brand as me, I'm using Prismacolor. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my dark brown pencil, and I'm just going to basically apply this from the bottom and above each of the lines that's added in. Now you can see here, if you're working with an image that doesn't have these lines, you can add them exactly the same way that I'm doing now. So it's not tricky to do, you don't need any drawing skills. I'm basically just weaving some lines that follow along the surface. Notice they come down in a bit of a diagonal. That's always going to look a little bit more natural if you are drawing them in yourself as well. I'm going to take this to about halfway here today. And I'll do the smaller one as well. I like to come out on those little edges just so they're get that same tone of colour. You can see adding in those little lines. Now, if you ever go out of the line like I just did there, I can kind of hide it and bring it back in. So you can always think of little ways to fix little mistakes. People aren't noticing the little things that you do when you're colouring. If you ever make a mistake, there's always a way to fix it. Now, we don't need to worry too much about cast shadows here because there's not a whole lot sitting over the top. However, in this little corner, we do have something. What you'll notice here is that little bit of foliage comes through, and if I follow that outline, I get to an intersection point here. See how this line here that I was following intersects with this line here. So what's happening? This line of the foliage continues on. So what that indicates to me is that this is sitting in front of the branch. The branch wouldn't just stop in real life. It's going underneath that foliage. So remember, when something's in front or above, the shadow's on the part that's below. So foliage is in front, so shadow comes around and onto that branch that's below. So nice big thick line there to help me show those levels between the objects. Now my next color is chocolate, and all I'm doing is I'm coming straight over the top, and you can see I'm blending up toward the top of the page in each of these little sections here. Now there's these little bits of fungus, I think, here on the branch. I did them orange in the class. You can do these any color you like. Such a small detail, but your image, if you're using a different image to us, probably won't have something like this, so I'm just going to ignore it for the time being. Notice that I'm trying to use each color equally, so after using those two colors, I've still got space left to add more into the page. The next color I'm going to be using now is a little bit of burnt ochre, and I'm coming straight over the top, and I'm continuing to extend further out toward the top of each section. So it's like those little lines created sections over the surface of the bark. Don't forget there's many different ways to color trees and bark as well. This is just one of them, and we've got such a big range of classes where we've tackled all different techniques as well. I like to show you different ways to tackle the one object over all different classes too, so when you do come to your own images, you get to pick and choose which techniques and textures you'd like to employ. Now the next color I'm going to be using is a little bit of Beige. Now this is the lightest color in the blend. And if I add this color over the dark colors, what will happen is I'll tint the color out and I'll make it appear kind of pastel. So I want to avoid that. I want to come in the leftover highlight part and really just overlap where that previous color has ended. It might look a little bit funny at this point because it's adding quite a lighter color to the blend. So it might make some of those darker colors look a little washed out. Don't worry too much if it does, because the way we combat that is just by repeating. Now, we've got two different things we can do here. We can repeat the previous steps exactly again by starting with the dark brown, and we just come in and we just layer it up and do your chocolate. So literally just doing the exact same thing again to build up the depth of the color, and then you'll have your beige at the end. Or what you can do is you can use a colorless blender pencil. Now the colorless blender pencil is just the same core as the pencil you're using, so you'll find different brands usually make their own blender pencils. It doesn't contain any pigment though, it only pushes around what you've already added to the page. So you need to have a good level of depth here before you consider using this. So if you've got a lot of little white speckles of tooth showing through and you've been very, very light-handed, you're going to need to repeat firstly. But if you've got some fairly good coverage, what you can do is just grab the blender and then just bring this really roughly and quickly from the shadow, blending out toward the highlight. Now, I really like to use this on trees because the outcome will be a little rough. I wouldn't use a blender if I want something really smooth like my skin tone or my clothing, but when I want a bit of texture in nature, it can be really nice to create almost that little bit of a roughness to the surface. So that's the branch all done. I'm going to do this little bit of foliage before we finish up the class as well. Now the technique I'm going to be using for this is called scumbling. Now scumbling is actually a proper shading technique. So when you do shading, I'll just show you at the bottom here, there's all different ways you can build up color. So usually we do like a little circle blend, or you can do like hatching, which is like this but close together. So hatching can also be like this. The closer it is, the more it looks like shadow. The further apart it starts to get, the more it looks like highlight. You've got cross hatching, which is back and forth like this. You got stippling, which is little circles or little dots. The closer they are together, the more that looks like shadow, and then you space them out as you get towards your highlight. And then you've also got scumbling. Now scumbling is kind of just like scribbling. All we're doing is basically a scribbly effect like this. But the closer the scumbles are together, the more it looks like shadow. And as we start to space these out, the more it looks like highlight. So you can see there, you can control how deep and dark it is by how dense your strokes are together. And it's the same with each type of shading technique. So I'm going to use a variation of scumbling in order to do our foliage. So let's come back here. Now firstly, what you can see if I'm looking at this little piece here is that I can see these little black lines, and most times when you'll come across trees and foliage like this, the artist will break it up with some form of line like this. Otherwise it's just going to look like a big blob on the page. So they want to indicate that something's happening. So wherever we add our darkest color, it's going to look like it's sitting further back, remember, like in shadow. So we can essentially create levels here, and we can create them by using the lines that the artist has already added. So using dark green, I'm just going to come straight over some of these lines. Now, why am I coming over the top? Because I want the bottom part here to look like that's sitting in front of this part behind. So we're creating almost like this sort of a level approach. I'm adding the shadow on the part that I want to appear further back. So I'm going to come through and do a few shadows around some of these lines that the artist has drawn before I do any shading technique. If you're coloring an image that doesn't have this, you can always break it up so yours doesn't just look like a big blob as well, just by doing these sort of shapes. Not tricky to do, just little circles, and you can always practice on the bottom of the page as well, just by doing different sizes like this. Okay, now once you've got that shadow, we're going to add a scumbling technique. So I'm just basically going to come through and I'm doing that scribbly effect from the shadow up toward the highlight. Now remember what I talked about before, the more dense it is, the more it's going to look like shadow. We want this to blend out with our highlight color, so as I get further away from that shadow, I'm going to space it out. So it's almost like the scumbling effect fades away a little bit. And you can even come up from the bottom as well. I even like to just color along the bottom because I don't like little bits of white showing where shadow would be. It can draw the eye toward this area in a bad way. So you can see my shadows are all kind of deep and dark because I went through and did that first. The next color that I'm going to be using is a little bit of apple green. And all I'm going to do is just do that scumbling technique straight over the top and start to blend out toward my highlight. Now this is easier to do if your pencils are sharper as well. So if you find that your pencils are feeling a little bit dull, just give it a quick turn in the sharpener just to make the edge a little bit more sharp. Now it's the spaces in the scumbling that make the texture, so remember that. If it's too dense, just going to look blended. So remember, like this over here, spacing it out is what gives you that texture overall. Now the next color is a little bit of spring green. So gradually getting lighter up toward that highlight. Now I'm not just filling in the whole area though. I'm coming through, I'm still doing that scumbling technique, and I'm still leaving the spaces. We'll get these tiny little bits of white left over in between. That's going to increase our contrast and help us look like we have more levels in the foliage. Now once we've done one round of the blend, it can look kind of light and we've got a little bit of texture of the tooth showing through in the page. We want to come through and repeat everything, which is going to build up the color and the texture even more. So I grabbed my dark green and I can just focus on layering down that scumbling effect again, straight over where I did the first time. Now I'm not worrying about matching up strokes straight on top. I'm literally just going over the same area and then just pulling it through. Next color is apple green. Let me just do the same thing. And you can see the second time around, it just comes up so much richer. You can obviously play with all different green blends as well. It does not have to be this blend here today. If you're doing a really large area, I like to even introduce grass green in between dark green and apple green. It'll give you a little bit more vibrancy, a little bit more variation. This is quite a small image here today, so I'm not really playing too much with the different tones of color. And then I've got my spring green. Now, if you've got any tooth showing through anywhere, you can always come back with the colors blender or repeat as well. Notice with this color, I'm not aiming to really cover, I'm just sort of dabbing it through because I want those tiny, tiny little bits of white. You can barely see them, but they help me to get that little bit of contrast overall. So then, that is actually the technique all done, and you can apply this to all different images now. So grab any image out, have a practice, adjust and adapt it to suit other styles of images. If you're in our class, we're going to be taking this into this, and we're going to be coloring up the rest of our image here today. So if you've enjoyed coloring this little part of the video tutorial, I'd love to see you join us in the full class. We'll be breaking down everything just as easy as I have here today, and our classes always come with free private tutoring as well. We have a very strong art therapy approach at Kid & Carter. I'm also a trained art therapist as well, so we always focus on confidence and helping you level up in a really secure environment. So you never have to feel nervous or embarrassed to ask for help. I've made every mistake myself, so it's all about just helping you feel confident to achieve these results. one step at a time. You always get lifetime access in our classes as well, and there's no lock-in contracts or time frames that you have to commit to being a member. So it's great if you just want to have a go and work on something for your self-care in your own time. So I'd love to have you join in, but thank you for watching this short tutorial today. If you found it helpful, please do consider sharing or tagging your friends or even giving me a follow as well. Thanks so much for watching and happy coloring!